Hi, welcome to JNS TV's new weekly podcast, Israel Undiplomatic. I'm Ruthie Blum, JNS columnist and editor, and my co-host is Ambassador Mark Regev, whose resume is floor-to-ceiling. At the moment, he is the head of the Abba Ibn Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations at the Reichman University, that used to be known as the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. Mark, though, has been known during the current war in Gaza as Prime Minister Netanyahu's key spokesman. And this is how I met him. I worked for the Prime Minister's office briefly prior to the war and during the war, the beginning of the war. And my main task there was to provide Mark with the main headlines of the news so that I could prepare him for mainly hostile interviews on CNN and MSNBC and BBC, where he had to stand and defend Israel against all kinds of accusations of genocide, apartheid, etc. But Mark and I, even though we share mainly share a worldview about Israel and about Israel's justice in this war, we argued all the time. And that's because I am way to the right of Mark, and the title of our podcast, Israel Undiplomatic. He's the diplomatic part, I'm the undiplomatic part. And now I'd like Mark to introduce himself a little more, give a little more background to how we met and what we're doing here.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here with you, Ruthie. We met, I think, in the first week of the war, back in October 23. I came back to do sort of reserve duty for the National Information Directorate, to do what we say in Hebrew, hasbara. And that's where I met you, because you were at the time working for the Prime Minister's office. It was reserve duty because I'd left the government. I'd been out of government since 21. I left the government in 21, and I got this great job at Reichman University, heading a think tank, the Abba Ibn Institute. But when this war broke out, and the Prime Minister's office said they needed me, of course I went back. I'm too old to be in a combat unit, apparently, but if I can help online and on the airwaves, I was, of course, very happy and eager to do it. I'm now back at the university. I've got two courses that I teach at Reichman University, one on U.S.-Israel relations and one on Israel and the United Nations. And I think I need to say this at the top. A lot of people who are listening to this or watching this program see me as the government spokesperson. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast with you, Ruthie, is because this is my chance. I'm no longer working for the government. Everything I say when we have our conversations on this weekly podcast, Israel Undiplomatic, everything I say is my own opinions. I'm no longer parroting the official government line, and I might have to remind people of that because I'm sure we will have disagreements between us as we talk. That's why we enjoy being together, because we've had some very good disagreements over the last couple of months. And I look forward to doing this with you every week, discussing what is in the news, why is it important, and how it affects our lives.
And I'd like to point out how it is possible to be somewhere on the same side of the political and ideological spectrum, and yet duke it out all the time on the details of the issues. And you and I did that a lot. I can remember one of our first main arguments was whether it was okay to attack foreign leaders who were saying things that were very enraging to me about Israel and about Israel's war effort. And you would curb me. You'd say, we have to be careful. We have relations with these world leaders. And so one of the reasons that I returned to writing columns was that now I don't have to be constrained, and I can let my right-wing opinions loose, let them loose without constraints and without considering on the one hand and the other hand. I'm not, I see things much more in a black and white way than you do, I think. I think you see a lot of gray areas.
Definitely, a lot of gray.
And one of the things I think that we have to talk about, obviously, the first thing we have to talk about is the Rafah operation. Speaking of controversial issues, I think probably more controversial outside of Israel than inside of Israel, though we've seen there are demonstrations now in the streets of Tel Aviv about that issue surrounding whether we should be conducting a military operation or only a diplomatic effort to secure the release of the hostages.
I want to start disagreeing with you. I wouldn't put together the demonstrations outside Israel and the demonstrations inside Israel. I don't agree with the demonstrators inside Israel. But to compare them with people who are openly anti-Israel, right, and who are burning Israeli flags and are yelling, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, to people who believe we should prioritize the hostages and nothing else is important, I don't think that's a good comparison. I think there's a serious difference. Once again, I might agree or disagree with the protesters, but I wouldn't compare them to the people who, let's say, today are on American university campuses parroting sort of anti-Israel paradigms, parroting anti-Israel tropes. I don't accept that comparison.
No, and I agree with you. I don't think that they're the same, but I will say there are agitators on both sides of the ocean. In America, those protests are not really about between the river and the sea, from the river to the sea. They're also anti-American. They are, death to America slogans are there along with death to Israel and anti-Semitism. It's all mixed up. Many of those protesters don't even know where the river is, where the sea is, what they're protesting. In Israel, there are also agitators riling up the families of the hostages in such a way that it has become an anti-government protest rather than a sincere appeal to rescue them. Because let's put it this way, despite what a lot of the left-wing media have been indicating and have been saying outright in Israel, it is not true that there's a person in this country who doesn't want to see the release of the hostages. And it is slander that anybody who has a different view of how to get them out of Gaza somehow doesn't care about them. The Prime Minister Netanyahu has been accused now of the left in Israel, by the left, of only caring about prolonging the war and keeping the hostages, and he doesn't care if they all die because he wants to remain in power. This is an outrageous statement, and they should be ashamed of themselves for saying it, whatever their view of Netanyahu is. We're at war right now with a vicious enemy, bent on our destruction, and that is why I also think that there is no either the hostages or a military operation. I think a military option is the only option to get them out of there.
So the first thing I think we have to say is that when one speaks to, or hears them, families of hostages, that first of all you have to feel for them. Ultimately, their loved ones are being held by Hamas. I mean, I think for a moment, if I was the father of a female soldier being held by Hamas, I don't know how you could live or sleep at night. It must be living hell for them, and that's without discussing the hostages. I'm just discussing, the families of the hostages. But I think what has happened is if you listen carefully to families of hostages, you get a whole spectrum of different views. There are some who are saying we have to a deal at any price to get our loved ones out. And there are others who say we shouldn't allow a single bottle of water into Gaza until the hostages are out. In other words, totally different opinions. From an Israeli perspective, one would be seen as being on the left, and the other one would be seen as being on the right. And they're all hostage families. You get a whole spectrum of views. You were critical of media before. I think what happens often is media, which has its own take on things, will often choose a hostage family that fits into their agenda.
Definitely.
And I think that especially with international media. International media will always focus in on the hostage, the family that wants to end the war and get their family out. And once again, a legitimate opinion. Families can express their thoughts. But once again, you get a whole spectrum of opinion. I saw a survey, right, amongst, not a survey, I've heard of hostage families, and I think that to say that they all want a deal at any price, yes, it's just not true. You've got a whole spectrum of opinion there, and they have to be respected for that.
But one of the things I don't understand about their protests, the families of the hostages, is they are all yelling, bring them home now,
no,
get them off.
Families of hostages.
Families of hostages.
Not the hostages.
No,
because they all have...
no, excuse me, the families of the hostages, right. And what they're saying is, bring them all home now. And the trouble is that Hamas, even if you wanted to make a deal with that devil and say, you know what, we don't care, leave them in power, we want all the hostages back. That's not on the table. Hamas is not offering all the hostages. Hamas did not say, okay, we'll give you all of the 132 hostages that we still have in exchange for your stopping the war. If they had said that, and that were an actual deal on the table, then there could be a debate about it. The debate would be then a serious one because all of us want those hostages home. And we might say, okay, so it's true that leaving Hamas in power endangers everybody, but we need the hostages home. But Hamas is not offering all the hostages. Hamas so far is offering the worst possible deals, and in principle, we should not be negotiating with them at all. And I think it's disgusting that the United States of America is treating Hamas as though it's like another country that's a side in a negotiation. These are not rational actors, they're malign actors, and they are witnessing how slaughtering people, raping women, raping men, torturing, mutilating, and kidnapping has succeeded for them. It's successful because if they keep it up, they have backing by other countries, and it's just shocking.
So I agree with the way you characterize Hamas, yes? Bloodthirsty terrorists, cynically using human beings in a brutal, disgusting, horrific way for their own political extremist agendas. I do very strongly disagree with what you said about negotiating with them. I think in the past, if you look at the history of the Jewish people, we've had to negotiate with some very, very terrible types. Herzl famously met the Tsar of Russia, right? He was no lover of the Jews, but to put forward his program, yes. Jabotinsky had the famous meeting with the head of the Ukrainian nationalists to get Jews out of Nazi Germany. There were talks done to help them escape by Jewish leaders, by Zionist leaders. You in the real world, you have to sometimes speak to very difficult and terrible people. That's the nature of the world. And I'd refer you back, Ruthie, to what happened in November when we got over 100 people out in a hostage deal. We got them out because of two things. But first of all, because of the military pressure on Hamas. And secondly, there was a deal that was negotiated through the Americans, the Egyptians, and the Qatari government. And that deal was worth doing. We saved over 100 lives, I think 120 altogether. And those people would still be in Hamas's dungeons had we not done the deal. And I think, if America, if Egypt, and even Qatar, and I have nothing but criticism of Qatar, but if they can help get our people out, we would be irresponsible in not trying to make the effort. If we could repeat the success of November now in May, I'd say it's worth doing. And I would not criticize the United States or Egypt or even Qatar for making an honest effort to try to get people out. If we can get hostages out, once again, not to capitulate to all of Hamas's crazy demands, but if there's a reasonable way to get people out, even a lopsided deal, as we had in November was also a lopsided deal, I would do it.
Well, but we just offered a very, very lopsided deal. Israel did, and brokered by Egypt and Qatar and Washington and Hamas. And then we even said, all right, we'll give them 2 days. We'll give them another week. We'll give them And then they came back and said, okay, we've accepted the deal. And they had not. They accepted some imaginary deal that they invented. Yes, we have capitulated a lot here. And yes, I agree that it was wonderful at the end of November that we secured the release of so many of the hostages. But the thing is, if you compare it to what you said, you don't know what you would do if your daughter were held captive in Gaza. And the joke is, of course, we don't know what we do. And sometimes I alternate. I say, you know what? I would say sell the country down the tubes for my child. But my first instinct would be to want to get a sawed-off shotgun and go out and kill as many people as I could in order to get her out. That's the difference between my view of this and the same thing with the Nazis. Yes, you want to negotiate Jewish lives, but in the end, unless you kill the enemy in high numbers, it's no good. And aside from that, you're encouraging other October 7th, which Hamas has vowed to repeat. Meanwhile, another problem is that all our other enemies are watching. Hezbollah in the north sees this, and Iran sees it, and we know that Hezbollah wouldn't hesitate. If you think Hamas are vile subhumans, Hezbollah is even worse, and they're even more powerful, and they have longer range rockets. And we cannot let them think that we're just sitting ducks. That's one thing. And the other is that, I heard a father of a hostage in Gaza, who said, I have 4 children. One of them is a hostage in Gaza. I have to worry about all my children. If we sell out to Hamas, I have just put my other 3 children in mortal danger. So, we're in a real dilemma.
So I think also, if you talk about the dilemma, I think sometimes it's placed in an artificial sort of way. Like either you can negotiate with Hamas and get a deal, or you fight Hamas and win the war. And of course, that's not true. That's simply counterfactual.
Right.
Hamas they're not going to suddenly become humanitarians. They're not going to suddenly, say, oh, this is terrible, we've taken these people hostage. They're only going to do a deal when they think it's in their interest to do a deal. And by applying the military pressure that we are, that doesn't make a deal a certainty. But I think it definitely raises the probability that a deal will happen. I'll give you an example. We had 2 weeks ago, for the first time, we received a video of a hostage, proof that they were alive, an American citizen, Hirsch.
Goldberg, Poland, yeah.
Yeah. And that they released that video just as there was talk of Israel going to Rafah.
Exactly.
And so I think there's no doubt that anyone who believes, we should just, stop doing anything and just negotiate, we'll get the people out. No. Hamas will respond, is more likely to respond to military pressure than anything else. And actually, by ratcheting up the military pressure, you increase the chances of a hostage deal. Here, I can be undiplomatic because I'm no longer working for the government. But here, look, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, his behavior during this conflict has been atrocious. I remember already back in October, just in the first weeks following the October 7th massacre, he called for a humanitarian ceasefire. Okay. In other words, Hamas comes and hits us and starts killing 1,200 people and taking another 250 hostage in Gaza. And then we have to stop. Right? We have to let Hamas, because when you say ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire, you've got to finish the sentence, which leaves Hamas in power. That's what it really means. Leaves Hamas in power, as you said correctly, to attack us again and again and again, as they themselves have said. We in November got, as we said a moment ago, we got, 120 people out? Had we listened to the UN Secretary General in October, we would not have got those 120 people out. Only the military pressure is facilitating the possibility of a hostage deal just in November. Hopefully, I hope that in May we can get a hostage deal that brings people out.
Well, you sound, I hope so. I hope more than that. I hope we blitz the crap out of Rafah and every place else in Gaza and rescue our hostages. That's what I would like to see. Not that we get some kind of good deal, because any deal we get, there's no way that Hamas is going to agree, say, okay, well, we'll give you back your hostages and then you can proceed with the war. No way, okay? Even with military pressure. And here's another thing. Egypt. We have a peace treaty with Egypt, okay? Now, Egypt, and this has been necessary for us. But let's not kid ourselves here. If not for Egypt, Hamas wouldn't be so heavily armed, okay? Because people are always saying that, oh, Gaza is under siege. Poor Gaza. Israel is keeping Gaza under siege. Baloney. Egypt has a border with Gaza. Egypt doesn't want any Gazan coming near its border, but it has allowed for years concrete weapons, drugs, whatever, to go through to Gaza. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able in the last years since the war in 2014, would not have been able to build that, continue building that huge underground tunnel network. So, and the other thing is Egypt is concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Really? It's barricaded its border so that no woman or child could, heaven forbid, get in there. And so, I've lost my tolerance for, and also Egypt didn't want us to go into Rafah because Egypt knows that once we're in Rafah, deep into Rafah, we will discover all the tunnels that go into Egypt. And, it doesn't like that, doesn't want to be exposed for that.
Can I tell you, Ruthie, if you look for perfection in international relations, you're never going to find them.
Perfection?
But no. I think Israel has legitimate gripes about certain aspects of Egyptian behavior. I don't deny that. I'm sure they've got gripes about some of the things that we do too. But I think it would be unfair to only speak about the negative, though it's there. I think we have to remember Menachem Begin signed that peace treaty with Anwar Sadat in Egypt. What was it, 1979 the peace treaty was signed? And in the close to half a century since then, right? More than 40 years, less than 50. I was never good at math, Ruthie, I apologize. I mean, that peace treaty has changed the Middle East. And it was the forebearer of peace with Jordan and for the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain. And I think as much as you can have complaints about this or that practice of Egyptian behavior, and let's be frank, part of the Israeli security establishment would agree with what you're saying. But I think you've got to see not just the trees, you've got to see the forest. There's no doubt in my mind that Egyptian-Israeli peace is an asset for this country. It was the first Arab country, in Egypt, once again, isn't just another Arab country. It's a very, very crucial, for many years it was the leader of the Arab world, probably still considers itself to be, and that country would have a diplomatic relationship with Israel, would have peace with Israel, would have an ambassador in Israel. I think these are things that we need to keep in perspective. Now, at the moment, everyone's talking about possible peace treaty with Saudi Arabia when this war is over, and I hope it's true also. You can have also, I'm sure you could sit here with a pen and paper and make a list of things that the Saudis are doing that upset us and that are counterproductive. Would we say no to peace to Saudi Arabia? Of course we would.
No. But you know what? We would have had peace with Saudi Arabia, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was on the way to brokering that peace, to making that peace with Saudi Arabia, thanks to the Abraham Accords brokered by former President Trump, perhaps future President Trump again, that the whole beauty of it was that Saudi Arabia saw Israel as the strong horse in the Middle East against the enemy Iran. And today, Washington is trying to unravel that by saying, no, we can't have peace without the Palestinians. And Saudi Arabia suddenly cares about the Palestinians, which it does not. But what Saudi Arabia is watching us, what you see, if actually, my instinct to take a sawed-off shotgun and kill everybody, that's sort of what the Saudis are waiting to see. They do not want to see us pandering to Hamas, to an Iranian proxy, or to Washington. Actually, the Gulf states told Israel after Netanyahu made his speech in 2015 to the joint session of Congress, when Obama boycotted it because he was so angry. The Gulf countries came to Israel and said, wow, you stood up to America. You stood your ground on the Iran deal. That precipitated the Abraham Accords. Today, Washington is doing everything it can to unravel that by saying, no, we have to have the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinians. And let's face it, no Palestinian today is a partner until they are de-radicalized, until they stop teaching their children to hate Jews and want to kill people and martyr themselves. There is no chance. And so they're ruining that possibility of peace with Saudi Arabia. Mark, I'm sorry.
So we'll see what happens. But I think from the bigger picture is this. There is more and more openness in the larger Arab world to accepting Israel as a legitimate part of the reason, not because these Arab leaders suddenly read Theodor Herzl and decided to become Zionists, yes, but because of realpolitik, and that is based on the assumption that Israel is a strong country, that Israel can defend itself, unlike other traditional friends of the Arab world, including the Americans. We're not going to become neo-isolationists. We're not going to suddenly move away. We're part of the Middle East. We can't move away. We live here. And we're strong. And we have common interests, specifically, as you referred to, on the issue of Iran. And I think, and I still remain optimistic, that we will see more and more peace with the Arab countries. I think if anyone tries to put all their energy now on the Palestinian-Israel track, as some in Europe and maybe some in Washington want to do, it's a waste of time, waste of energy. It's like hitting your head against the proverbial brick wall. You'll just get blood and nothing else. But where is there room to move the peace process forward? It's with the Arab countries, specifically maybe with Saudi Arabia, but that will lead to other Arab and Muslim countries too, because of Saudi Arabia's central position both in the Arab League and in the Conference of Islamic Countries. And if we can get that deal and expand the peace process with the Arab countries, which is possible, maybe, I don't believe in the short term and the medium term, but as more and more Arab countries recognize Israel and live in peace with Israel, hopefully that will influence the Palestinians as well, because they're ultimately an integral part of the Arab world too. But if you start moving and say we've got to move first with the Palestinians, unfortunately nothing's going to happen. In fact, then you give the Palestinians and their extremist and dysfunctional leadership, you give them a veto on moving forward in peace. And then the whole region suffers. In fact, what was the great thing about the Abraham Accords? The great thing was that we took away the Palestinian veto on the peace process.
Exactly, because the whole idea, the whole concept that peace has to go through the Palestinians, peace in the Middle East, was a lie. And that's why it's not just that it's a waste of time to deal with a peace process and a two-state solution. It's not just that it's a waste. It's that it's bad, it's harmful, it's counterproductive, but it's also evil, because what you're doing is you're ignoring reality in order to fit something into some fantasy you have. And that's dangerous. And that is why I think that the current administration in Washington is completely wrong.
You know, Ruthie, I was Yair Lapid, who's the leader of the opposition here in Israel. He said it's not the right time to talk about a two-state solution. And I heard a podcast a week or two ago with Yair Golan, who wants to be the new head of this left-wing bloc of the Labour Party and Meretz and others. And he was asked about a Palestinian state, and he refused to use the term. He talked about we have to disengage from the Palestinians. I mean, he obviously supports the Palestinian state, but he knows it's not the right time to talk about it. And you have to ask the question, why isn't the people who are on the left of Israel willing to talk? So, they want to run away from the issue of Palestinian statehood. And I'll tell you what's happened. Even people who do believe in real peace, they're willing for some sort of compromise. They don't believe we've got a partner. And you know why? Because the so-called moderate Palestinians on the West Bank, their leadership refused to condemn October 7th. And in polling that we see of Palestinians on the West Bank shows that their own polling some 72%, or was it 71%, support the October 7th massacres. So people in Israel look at the Palestinians. I don't know how people look at Israel, they look from London or from Brussels or from Washington, but people here, once again, when leaders of the Israeli left are not willing to publicly embrace Palestinian statehood, you know there's a problem. And I'll explain to you why I think it happened. I remember in 2015, there was the terrible murders at the Palestinian village, where Israeli extremists threw a firebomb into a house, and they burnt alive a family. 3 people were killed, and I think a baby was very badly burnt.
Right.
It was called Duma, I think, the name of the village. And that same day, right, Netanyahu publicly condemned that horrific act. He rang up the Palestinian president and condemned the act and said, "We will get to the bottom of this. We'll bring these people to justice." That same evening, there was a meeting of the Israeli Security Cabinet, and they authorized the security services to use every tool in the anti-terrorist toolbox, every tool, to bring these people to justice. And they were. And the person responsible is serving consecutive life sentences. If Abu Mazen had taken a different track, he's incapable. But let's say hypothetically, had he condemned October 7th, had he said the people who did those murders and those rapes and that disgusting and horrific behavior that we all saw on October 7th, had he disassociated himself from it and condemned it, had he started to move against Hamas cells across the West Bank, you don't think there'd be more people in Israel in favor of a two-state solution? Of course there would be. But he showed...
Well, luckily, he didn't do that because it would have been a lie. I mean, we know from his past behavior and current behavior and the way he says things differently in English and in Arabic. That's like his predecessor, Arafat. We know that, okay? So it's just as well that he didn't condemn it because it would have been a lie, not to mention...
But even he could have gone through the motions, and he didn't even do that.
But you didn't even have to get to October 7th. He pays the salaries of those people. The people who committed the October 7th massacre, they get stipends, or their families do, if they were killed during their martyrdom activities. Their parents get monthly salaries that are higher than by the way, a lot of Israelis earn too, may I say. He pays their salaries. The West Bank, as you call it, I call it Judea and Samaria, but the West Bank is now such a hotbed of terrorism that I think a lot of people don't realize. We keep saying we're in a war on our southern border, and we're also in a sort of mini war on the northern border. But in the center, we have also a war going on against terrorism, and the people in the center of the country are in danger of an October 7th massacre from Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists right there, right in their neighborhood. And by the way, they make no bones about wanting to do that. So it isn't merely like, oh, let's let them condemn it. And by the way, Fatah, Abu Mazen's faction, there were also Fatah terrorists who committed atrocities on October 7th. And I know this because I actually spoke to one of the interrogators of what you call the Nukhba terrorists. Those are Hamas. They're like their I don't know what you call them, militia, special forces. But other people participated in that, and that brings us now to the civilian population of Gaza. We keep hearing about the poor civilians. Do you know how many civilians participated in the October 7th massacre, that lauded it, that cheered when they saw women's bodies being hauled in, when they saw someone's head being on a stake being brought in? They cheered. And when we had the first hostage release deal, civilians of all kinds, women, children, were coming out and throwing rocks at the Red Cross vans taking the hostages away. So you'll excuse me if I have no sympathy for the civilians of Gaza. None. And they voted in Hamas, by the way.
So I have a different perspective. First of all, if there's some 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip, and let's say, a third of them are children under the age of 12, I don't want to see them starving. I think that's against fundamental Jewish morality. I think, I don't think we can, we should never go down, degenerate to the moral level of our enemies. I think every Hamas activist is a legitimate target. I unfortunately know that in every conflict there is always collateral damage. You can't fight a war without, zero collateral damage. But the idea that I would somehow see, let's say, Gaza's children as a legitimate target, that I'm not willing to accept, Ruth. I do know what you say is true, that Hamas has a lot of support, that Hamas has a lot of popular support, that I saw the way the hostages were, when they were taken on the first day of October 7th, how they were taken, people were celebrating and people were beating them up. I've seen all the pictures. But I think if we will, defeat Hamas militarily, and people in Gaza understand that Hamas's path only brings suffering for them, I think that's probably the best thing we can do. I think also there's a realpolitik side to it as well. First of all, I said we for moral reasons, we want to safeguard civilian population as best we can in the framework of fighting and winning this war. We have to win. But I think at the same time, to get international support, specifically American support for winning this war, I think we have to show them that we're also taking into account the needs of the civilian population, and we have been, and we will continue to do so. Because let's say you don't accept what I'm saying. Let's say Ruthie says, I don't give a hoot about Palestinian children. They live in a society which is sick. They live in a society run by extremists. And just as German children were killed in the bombings by the Allies in the Second World War, so let's say you don't accept my argument that we have a moral responsibility to do our best to safeguard innocent civilians, especially children. But at least from a realpolitik point of view, you've got important allies in North America and in Europe, and you don't want to, from a political point of view, from a diplomatic point of view, you want to be able to tell them that you are in fact doing all you can to distinguish between Hamas, which is a legitimate military target, and between the civilian population. Here there is, of course, a lot of hypocrisy. Because I think Israel, obviously we make mistakes, everyone makes mistakes. In this world there is no perfection. But if you look at the behavior of the Israeli army and you compare that to the behavior of other Western armies, even the American army, the British army, the Australian army, when they've fought wars in urban areas against a ruthless enemy, I think if you actually look at the ratio between combat and civilian deaths, between killing terrorists and inadvertently hitting a civilian, actually the IDF comes out much better than other Western armies. And we should be praised for it. I remember someone said to me once in an interview, they said, but you're asking people to leave their homes yet again, right? Being displaced. So you have to say, so it's better they stay in a war zone and get killed. You have to distinguish between, what is bad and what is worse. And then obviously it's not nice asking someone to leave their home, yes, but is it better for them to stay and get killed in a conflict? No. And so asking people to leave their homes to save their lives is a good thing and should be praised and not condemned.
But again, this brings me back to Egypt. Not only back to Egypt, but back to us. Yes, we're always proving to the world that we're the good guys. Not that we should have to by now, but okay. And not that it even helps. The more humanitarian aid we've let in, and we keep letting more and more and more, the more people outside of Israel are accusing us of genocide, apartheid. The International Criminal Court wants to issue arrest warrants for our leaders. So it's not as though it helps us. Now, getting back to the children. I
disagree. I think it does.
Okay, you think it helps us? Well, it helps us at least make the argument. Okay, yes, it helps you maybe be able to win an argument. But at this point, what I'm trying to say is there are children in Gaza. You're right. Little babies are not guilty of anything. But there are 10-year-olds who have shot RPGs at our soldiers.
100%.
And I don't care if that's a 10-year-old. I'm sorry, okay? That's the fact.
No, and also I think there's a lot of hypocrisy here from part of what, the children's rights groups, because, there were all these stories like a decade ago out of Africa, how disgusting it was that certain African leaders and militias were enlisting children, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and turning them into child soldiers, and it was considered a war crime. But when Palestinians do it, somehow it is ignored. And you see the amount of minors who are involved in violence organized by Hamas and to be frank,
Summer
Fatah and
camps.
others.
Summer
Yes,
camps.
and so it's very difficult for us. But I do think, I really do think we are a democratic society. We're the one and only Jewish country on the planet, and we do have values that we should uphold. Never commit suicide, right? You don't have values, so you die tomorrow. But in the framework of winning the war, and I stress it, we have to win the war. And that means going into Rafah. But in the framework of winning the war, we have to do the best we can to distinguish between combatants and legitimate military targets and the innocent civilian population. And what we're doing now, we've already established.
We are doing our best. We've made phone calls. We dropped flyers. We've done everything we can. In the meantime, our citizens are displaced from their homes. The fact that we care about our citizens and Hamas does not care about its citizens, that's a separate issue. Ours are staying with family members or in hotels or whatever. And in Hamas says, good, we'll be in our tunnels. We'll appropriate all the aid, the foreign aid that comes in, and let the people of Gaza starve or get killed by Israeli return fire. That's good. That's good for us. So we're worried about the Gazan population, and Hamas is not. And the international community is still pressuring us instead of Hamas, instead of saying, listen, by tomorrow morning, every single hostage, dead, alive, wounded, not wounded, men, women, soldiers, every single one of them is back in Israel, or I don't know what, or we were starving you, we're carpet bombing you. Okay, I'm sorry, there's no threat, you see, if you have a terrorist like you have Sinwar. There is nothing you can do. And by the way, again, we saved his life. He was in prison. He was released under a hostage exchange deal, the Gilad Shalit deal. Now, the whole country was in uproar over that. We fought one another over whether we should get Gilad Shalit back and return all these and release violent murderers from Israeli jails. And there was an argument over it, but we said, we can't. We love our soldiers. We can't abandon him. And so even the people who didn't want that deal wept with tears of joy when he returned. And Sinwar was one of those. Now, many others repeated their terrorist acts. Sinwar was one of those. But not only that, while he was in an Israeli prison, he had a brain tumor, and we cured him of it. So I would say that we take being Mr. Nice Guy way too far and get very little dividend from our so-called friends outside.
So when you tell me that Hamas doesn't give a hoot about the lives of Palestinian people, you're obviously telling it's factual. They don't give a hoot. And I think it's important to understand the unique level of depravity that Hamas is all about. And people don't understand this, and you don't get it by watching, international news networks. No. But let's look at one fact. History has shown a lot of very dark and horrific and beasts. Whether it's the Nazi regime in the middle of the 20th century or the parallel Stalinist regime in Russia, right? Millions of people killed. Right? And we, as Jews, we had a Holocaust Memorial Day just this week. 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. But the Nazis tried to hide their crimes. There's a very famous speech by Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, where he's meeting the people involved in the final solution, yes, the murder or the extermination of the Jews. And he says, what we're doing is important. We're saving European civilization from these terrible Jews and so forth. But he says, but we can never talk about this. It has to remain a secret, right? And Stalin, he was starving and killing the Ukrainians and never advertised the fact. It's all done quietly, and if allegations were raised in the West or something, it was always denied. It was anti-communist, anti-Soviet propaganda, yes? What happened on October 7th? They came in and they advertised. They publicized their own crimes. And
on Facebook, on Twitter.
On Telegram, right? They put it up live. In other words, they were proud of their beheadings and the massacres and the mutilations. And I've seen too many of these videos. But it shows you what we're dealing with. And I'd ask the following question. Maybe this we have to finish because our time is running out. They killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7th. Given the opportunity, given the capability, would they have killed 12,000?
Of course.
Would they have killed 120,000? Would they have killed 1,200,000 had they had the capability? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is true. And when Israelis say we're dealing with a genocidal terrorist organization, right? I don't think it's an exaggeration. Hamas, given the capability, given the opportunity, would kill us again and kill more of us. And that's why it's crucial that we win this war. And then when the war is over, not only will hopefully we get the hostages out, but that Hamas will no longer run the Gaza Strip and that Hamas's military machine will be destroyed.
Absolutely. I would just add to that two things. One is that I think when the war is over, we cannot have any Palestinian entity at the moment. Maybe when apples grow on cherry trees. After this war, there is no Palestinian entity or leader who can rule Gaza and next to whom we can feel safe.
Ruthie, we're not going to agree about everything. That's clear. But I do want to say the following. If anyone watching the show wants to send me a question or to Ruthie a question, please do so. And you got to follow us on social media. You go to JNS and you can hear this program. And we look forward to being here. I look forward to being here. Ruthie looks forward to being here again next week. See you then.